Good evening, everyone. My name is Charlisa Powell, and I am a City with Dwellings board member and the chair of our Advocacy and Education Committee. I'd like to welcome you to the latest installment of our Roots and Responses Community Forum, which is a program designed to bring together folks from the front lines of this work, leaders from our community, innovative voices, and you to examine a particular area of impact and envision how we together can achieve progress. Tonight, our topic will focus on evictions. Our speakers for the evening are Crystal O'Connell, the Diversion and Outreach Specialist at City with Dwellings, Dan Rose of Housing Justice Now here in Winston-Salem, Francis Sullivan, a housing attorney in the Winston-Salem Legal Aid Office, and Vanessa Bradley, who has had firsthand experience with the eviction process. Our moderator for tonight is Russ May, a founder and board member at City with Dwellings. And our virtual host for tonight is Emily Norris, the communications specialist at City with Dwellings. Emily, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Charlisa. Just a quick word about how this will work tonight. As we run through the evening, if you have questions, when you have questions, I invite you to put those either in the chat or in the question and answer section. Our guests will all have an opportunity to speak and share tonight with questions and conversation woven together by our moderator, Russ May. And then following everyone's time of sharing, we will open it up for questions that you might have. This is an active dialogue, and so please don't hesitate to drop those in there. And if you need to get my attention, send it multiple times. Russ.
Yes, real honor to be here. I see on this agenda, I get a chance to speak at the beginning and the end, which is really dangerous. So I'm actually going to save most of my comments for, I just want to see how everyone goes, because this is a really good group we have today. What I want to say to get us started, and for those who are familiar with the work of City with Dwellings, these things should generally make sense. We have in Winston-Salem a homeless crisis. We have an affordable housing crisis. And if you have those two things, it is very likely and possible we also have an eviction crisis. And we see that in the sense that we rely on evictions to see any movement and success around issues of getting people housed. When there are no evictions, the system clogs because of that affordable housing crisis that we have. And so our system almost has a success rate for housing folks that's also paired up with evictions. That's an issue that we can't be casual about with our work around ending homelessness. And so we're going to kind of travel upstream here to that level and hear a lot about what's happening. Here's the deal. Look, eviction is complex. It's riddled with gaps in the research, even at the best levels. And definitions at times are hard to come by. When we're talking about evictions, what are we including in that? When we're talking about the cost of evictions, what costs are we talking about? So there's a lot that we're trying to wrap our heads and our arms around. But we do, regardless of where the gaps are, we see the impact of evictions in our community on the people, the families that we care about and we serve, and even in our neighborhoods that we live among. We see that impact, and some of the folks we have here today see it through their work. They see it daily. So that's what we're going to try to get down to here is what are we seeing on the ground? What can we build that we need to be building together? And ultimately, as we go through this conversation, I hope that some of the things will be clarified for your sake, for my sake, around what are some of the research statistics, numbers around evictions here in our area. And also just what are we talking about with evictions? What kind of definitions are we working with? What kind of costs are we working with? So we got some incredible people here. I'm hoping that y'all will be able to kind of fit some of those pieces of information into your what you share. But I'm looking forward to kind of teasing out what you share and adding in some other questions that come up. So let's just get rolling here. Krista, thanks for the invitation to be a part of this, Krista. I'm going to send it in your direction now.
Cool. So when I've been thinking about what evictions have to do with City with Dwellings and homelessness, I've been thinking about a lot of the diversion work I do. Generally, evictions don't lead to immediate literal homelessness, but to being unstably housed. So living in hotels, being doubled up with friends and family, kind of sometimes cycling through those friends and family that you have. These unstably housed folks tend to make up a lot of the diversion calls I get. And at some point, most of these folks that are unstably housed find themselves on the cusp of literal homelessness. Hotels are really expensive. It's hard to get out of them once you start. It's hard to maintain. Friends and family might get tired of having you there, having your kids there. And oftentimes they're breaking their own leases having you there in the first place. Due to the length of time an eviction stays showing on your record, folks that have experienced evictions have really just hardly any options for stable housing for years to come. Because of wage stagnation, the rising cost of housing, eviction, homelessness, they're all interconnected. And with more and more renters finding themselves without any housing options, but the ones that have them paying over 30% of their income, sometimes up to 50%, and with there just not being a lot of resources wrapped around people that are just experiencing poverty. More and more people that are renting are really, really vulnerable to evictions. That's all I'd like to say.
So, Chris, I want to kind of piggyback on a piece of this here. So when you said they're not immediately homeless, they double up with people, family and friends and things like that. Is that not homeless? Or are they not homeless when they do that? If you got evicted, are they not becoming homeless when they go to that place?
Not by HUD definition. By HUD definition, you have to literally be on the streets or in a shelter.
And then, okay, so what we're saying is that when folks are evicted, the trend is not that they go to the shelters or to the streets. They've got a place that's in between. And are they showing up on anyone's radar that we're aware of? And so we'll start to bring in other folks here, but as far as City with Dwellings, I guess, are they showing up on our radar when they end up doubling up?
They're showing up on our radar when wherever they are doubled up at is tired of them being doubled up there. And they're kind of at this last leg of, I'm going to be literally on the streets. What do I do now?
So you've been with City with Dwellings for a few years now. Do you see that peak at any particular time? Are there times when people get tired of people staying with them? Or is it a constant thing or whatever?
With the pandemic, it's definitely been different, but in the summer, it's more so, you've got kids at home and kids are loud because they're kids. So it happens more when everybody is crammed in this often way too small house altogether.
I think I have a question for you. I don't expect us to have the answer right here, but it just feels like it's right there. I feel like we're talking about families a lot. Is City with Dwellings dealing with a lot of families who are in that situation versus like individual persons who face that kind of eviction and then doubling up?
I think it's a decent mixture, really. I mean, really probably half and half. Okay,
good. I'm going to probably come back to you with things, but let's go ahead and bring Francis in at this point. Francis, this is your world to a degree, not the only thing you do, but you're definitely in the mix big time here. What are you seeing and kind of what do you want to share with us this evening?
Yeah, thanks, Russ. To be honest, it kind of is the only thing I do, but I appreciate the trying to give me a compliment. So basically, the prompt that I was going off of is what is our role with evictions? And so I apologize if I don't talk for the time I was allotted, but I'm not a very long-winded person. So I'll give a breakdown for anyone who doesn't know. I work at Legal Aid of North Carolina. It's a nonprofit law firm, and we serve clients of low income throughout the state, dealing with a variety of civil legal issues. That includes housing, evictions. And so that's where I come in. People call our central intake unit, and then if they meet certain qualifications, they'll get transferred to the local office where they live. And so that's what I do. I represent people throughout the whole process of the eviction, from the time when their landlord is first saying, we want you out, the court process, the appeal process, and then the final stage, which is the end of the line, the sheriff coming and, changing the lock. So we're there for them throughout that whole process. We deal a lot in court. We deal a lot with trying to negotiate with landlords and do our own sort of trying to divert evictions. So that's what I do. And there are a lot of challenges with that, but a couple specific to the pandemic is a lot of times people need more than just an attorney. And I think you guys can definitely appreciate that. I can only represent people with the laws that are already out there. I can't necessarily change them or argue that they're not fair in court. And so a lot of the challenges that I face are like what you guys said, there's a crisis and I can only do what the system allows me to do a lot of times. And so that's one challenge. And then another one is that even when we do see changes happening to try and help people, like for example, the eviction moratorium with the pandemic, we find that landlords are usually able to find ways to get around it nonetheless. And unfortunately, courts kind of allow that to happen as well. So it's a struggle, but that's what I do. And unfortunately, I think that the pandemic has kind of just highlighted a problem that we already knew was there. And we're worried for what's going to happen when this last moratorium ends. I think we're going to see a lot more evictions than we already do. Our last legal protection will be gone. And as you guys said, there's an affordable housing crisis. So that's kind of what I'm seeing right now.
So let's kind of catch everybody up here, Francis, on this moratorium. So nobody gets evicted, right? Like that's
yeah, moratorium is probably the worst name in the world for that, because that is definitely not true. But a lot of, I think, media coverage makes it seem like that's what it is. But no, the moratorium only protects certain people in certain cases, and it's on the tenant, honestly, to enact that protection for themselves as well. And so it's not a moratorium by any means. And the moratorium, like I said, it ends in 8 days, but it was being poked and prodded throughout the whole time it first passed in September.
So what you mean by it's on the tenant is I could still get evicted if I don't know enough to be able to kind of claim what was a temporary kind of reprieve from a financially related eviction. Is that what you're saying?
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly right. And the governor of North Carolina did pass an additional thing to kind of say, okay, landlord, you have to tell the tenant about this protection. That sounds great, but unfortunately in practice, the judge and the magistrates are not really going to make sure that that necessarily happened. And so we are still seeing that if the tenant doesn't show up and say, look, I'm protected by this, they are probably still going to get evicted.
But the good news is that if I do that, and I did that for the last 15 months or 12 months, then at the end of all of this, I start from zero, or I start with all of those months that I might not have been paying on my
rent back? Great question. The moratorium and the governor's order are very clear that landlord can still charge rent throughout that whole time, can still charge late fees, can still ask for rent, can still file a court case. And so you're exactly right. You're looking at upwards of a year and a half potentially of all this money you're going to suddenly owe in 8 days. So it's going to be tough.
But there are plenty of agencies out there that can pay rent for me, right? No. Okay. Francis, one more question for you, I think, and then I'm gonna actually I'm gonna poke on something you said, and then we're gonna get over to Dan. But listen, actually let me poke on this from first, and then I'll come back to a question. I heard Krista say something about stays on your record, and so that's true, right? Like an eviction stays on it follows you.
That's true. Even if you win your case, if you just do a quick search of somebody's civil record, you'll see that there was an eviction filing, and there's no way to get rid of that. So even best case scenario, you win and you were protected, it's still going to show up.
But look, I can get rid with the right pieces in place and with some good legal support. I can get rid of like a felony conviction at some, like different convictions can be expunged. So can this not be expunged at any point?
Nope. The short answer is no. There's no such thing as eviction expunction. There are legislators pushing for it because it does hurt you and follow you going forward. But right now, there is literally no equivalent to that. Like I said, the best case is you win, but it's still going to show up that there was a filing against you.
So that's ultimately getting to this, like, poking, you don't have to answer that, but you said something like, you can only fight the laws that exist. You can't work towards like this issue of they're not even fair. I don't even want to like deal with these laws. Can you just let me know like what's not fair about them so we can get to work on some of that? We'll talk later. We'll talk later. Now, do you find yourself where you're able to be in that role of sharing, being an advocate on the side, or does working with legal aid kind of prevent you from those off the clock roles?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. We get a lot of different funding from a lot of different places, and we have rules that come with that. As you guys know, with money comes a lot of rules. And so I'm not really allowed to step outside of my role, even if it's outside 5 o'clock. So I am restricted with what I can do advocacy wise.
Okay. If you were to like change your name in the chat box to something we'll accept. All right, let me spin it over to Dan for a minute here. Dan, catch us up on what you're seeing, and you can follow whatever prompt you were given at the beginning. But ultimately, I want to know what you're seeing on the ground. But I want to keep working towards this clearer definition of what we're talking about with evictions here in Winston as well. Help us out.
Okay, so I wear two hats. I am a core member of Housing Justice Now. We are a community organization, not a nonprofit, not any kind of affiliation to any other group, but we are part of the local Democratic Socialists of America. And so we believe that housing is a human right. It should not be a commodity. It should not be a source of profit. And with that, evictions, homelessness, and other forms of misery. So I do that with as much time as I can find. And I also study eviction and housing as a sociologist at Winston-Salem State University. And what we have been seeing in terms of both the community work and my research is that, like Francis said, so many evictions are still happening during this moratorium. There are less evictions happening right now than there would be in a typical year because some tenants have been able to assert protection for not being able to pay the rent. However, it's still close to 50% of the evictions that are being filed in the Forsyth County courts that are leading to judgments against the tenants, and they are removed from their homes by the sheriffs. And so I can say more about the system. And I think following some of what Francis said about the ways that eviction follows you, it's on your record whether or not you win or lose your case. The ways that Krista said housing is unaffordable. We need systematic change. We need guarantee of housing in our society. We need eviction expungement. We have seen landlords who filed evictions against children. We've seen landlords who have said, well, I have to make every person in the house a defendant. So I listed this 8-year-old kid as a defendant on this eviction. And now that child will have an eviction on their record. By the time they turn 18, they will likely still be having difficulties getting housing before they even have a chance. We see that rents in Winston-Salem, while they're not as bad as, say, Washington, D.C. or Chicago or San Francisco, they are climbing fast in that we have wage stagnation. Again, as Krista mentioned, Reynolds is gone, Haynes is gone. You cannot typically earn enough money to afford housing in Winston-Salem unless you're among the upper middle class. And so we have in our city council a group of folks who do not necessarily want to fund affordable housing. They want to leave it to private developers who make really paltry commitments, maybe 20% of their units. And the definition of affordable housing is very skewed. We have a court system in North Carolina that evicts for non-payment, typically, not always during the moratorium, but typically if you're a day late or $1 short, which we're about to go back to in 8 days, there is no excuse and you will be evicted in North Carolina. So we need legal changes. tenants who are facing bad conditions, and we've been inside a lot of our fellow renters, our houses are falling apart. The water leaks may be driving up bills that take money out of our pockets that we could be paying rent with. So slum conditions are a huge factor in evictions. It is a macro level problem. It's a historic problem. East of 52 and north of 52 has always been redlined in Winston-Salem. And so the dispossession and inability to accumulate wealth around housing as whites, especially middle class and upper class whites, have been able to do throughout the last century or more has not been there for Black and brown communities. Latinx communities in Winston-Salem oftentimes do not show up to court. Most tenants do not show up to court, but especially tenants who may be undocumented, who may have warrants against them in some cases, are afraid to show up to court. So we have a system that's inaccessible. We don't have guaranteed representation for tenants in Winston-Salem. Other cities have done this. It's starting to become a trend around the United States. So there's a lot of things we can do systematically to challenge evictions. If I can add one more thing, it's that our group is seeking to help each other stand up and fight back against evictions. So when you go to the clerk of court's office, you can ask for new evictions that have been filed. They're public record. So it's a double-edged sword, right? Any landlord knows you've been evicted, will discriminate against you when you apply for housing. But we can also find out who's being evicted and go and encourage them to fight, encourage them to connect with legal aid, let them know there's an appeals process. And appealing an eviction is something most tenants don't know they can do, but it can stop the eviction. And if enough of us are able to connect with tenants who are being evicted and encourage them to appeal, there's also a way that we can kind of clog the courts and overwhelm the courts with appeals, overwhelm the courts with people showing up to fight back, asking for continuances, asking for translators if they don't speak English fluently. And so there's a number of things that we can do as community organizers as well. But again, we're looking at big picture change that's needed. You talk about going upstream from homelessness to evictions. Evictions, we need to go upstream from there and find out why there are so many evictions happening. And I haven't even mentioned the evictions that don't happen in the courts, where landlords illegally remove tenants from their homes. Hotels are a huge offender when it comes to that. Residents of hotels have tenant rights that they are often violated by the Winston-Salem City Police, often goes and does evictions from hotels in the city as well. So there are a lot of illegal evictions that are taking place as well that we need to organize to stop.
So Dan, I know that we have a guest who may be sharing with us. It looks like that they were on the phone and that they had to maybe hop off. But Emily, if you'll help us, when that comes back on, we just want to jump right into that connection. But in the meantime, I want to piggyback on a few things. And let me start with where you started and ended. And that is, I just want to know, like, evictions are not just a thing, they are a canary in the mine, a very sick canary. So what is it symptomatic of? I'm kind of throwing a big philosophical question at you, but help us understand a little more of some things that evictions are symptomatic of in terms of community problems, issues.
Yeah, so I would say poverty and racism. We live in a racialized capitalist society wherein people of color are the ones who are bearing the brunt of unaffordable housing, bearing the brunt of low-wage jobs, undereducation, et cetera, et cetera. Eviction is both a consequence of poverty and a cause of poverty. So we also have to understand that while it is a symptom, that it also leads to a lot of other negative consequences. So when we talk about doubling up, going to hotels, I've talked to countless women who have doubled up with abusive partners after they've been evicted. So they were out of an abusive home on their own and then evicted and had to return to an abusive partner. There are drug issues, obviously, that can lead to eviction, but also can result. So it's kind of a reciprocal sort of feedback loop that's happening here with poverty. Evictions are a result, but they also exacerbate poverty. They also lead to other social issues, such as domestic abuse, mental illness, drug abuse, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, we City with Dwellings. I don't know if you've noticed our social media account, but we like memes. Evictions is a consequence and a cause of poverty is very, very meme friendly, Emily. Listen, you brought up slumlord situations, but don't we have protections against slumlord situations? I mean, aren't we safe from that being a piece of this puzzle, or is that how's that fitting into the equation here?
So one of the few things that tenants can do to fight back against a slumlord is to call code enforcement within the city limits. It's the city of Winston-Salem, but Forsyth County also has a code enforcement department. The enforcement of code in Winston-Salem has been extremely lackluster. We have numbers from the city that show a decline, not just during the pandemic, but for the last 5 years, code inspections have gone down, down, down. Oftentimes, code inspections are being used against low-income homeowners. Your grass is too high, you have a boarded up window, something like that, where homeowners that are on the brink are being victimized by our code enforcement office, whereas renters who are seeking some sort of justice from their landlords who won't make repairs are being told things like, well, we don't inspect for mold, or you have to film it yourself. So from March to May, there were no code inspections last year. And then since May until only very recently, the code enforcement department would not go into people's homes. And we understand that code enforcement wants to be safe. They want to protect their workers, but they were asking tenants to film their own code inspections. Rachel from Housing Justice Now can testify. She is a professional photographer, and she tried to video inspections for tenants. And every time they would come back and say, no, we can't see under the sink enough. You have to go back and turn more lights on so we can see if it's really leaking. Or no, you have to have continuous film. And for tenants over the last year, it was nearly impossible to get any sort of code enforcement against their landlords, to the point where it's less than half of what it was 2 years ago, but it's been declining for 5 years, like I said. So that's one of the few things tenants have that they can use to get some justice with a slumlord. They can sue for rent abatement, but most tenants, there's not a culture of documentation. They don't have printers, or they can't print glossy photos to show judges. And they don't really know that they can sue for rent abatement if they've been paying and the conditions have violated what do they call the warranty of habitability. So there's not a whole lot of knowledge out there. We're trying to change that, but also there's not a whole lot of support from the city and the county, which can be doing more to hold slumlords accountable.
So I will weave in others so everybody else can be ready too. There's some questions that are coming in, but I just want to make sure that there's a few pieces that you brought up there, Dan, that I want to make sure we're on the same page with. So my neighbor, for example, got out of their bathtub and the floor fell like right where they were. So it had to be fixed. And the landlord says, I'm not going to fix that right now, or any version of that story. So they didn't pay their rent because they had to, figure out how do we leverage what we do. So they don't pay rent. Do you know what the outcome of this story is, Dan?
Typically, the landlord will file an eviction for non-payment, and typically there is no excuse for non-payment. And so why didn't you call code enforcement, the judge might say, or why didn't you document this? Where's your photographs? How come you don't have proof? The landlord says you didn't tell them that the floor caved in. Well, I called him several times. Well, a verbal communication, which is what most tenants do, does not hold up in a sort of they said court situation.
So, right. Goodness. I'm going to come back with another question. Let me weave Francis back into this. And again, Emily, let me know if our guest jumps back in. So Francis, one of the questions is what's available for legal services that are cost-friendly to our low-income neighbors. Tell me a little bit about like how you get connected with low-income folks in terms of serving, how legal aid does, and what other legal services might be available to folks who are low-income.
Well, Legal Aid is the only free nonprofit law firm there is. As far as other low-income attorneys, there's a lawyer referral service that Legal Aid can refer people to, but I think it still costs like $50 for half an hour. So, I mean, we're really the only law firm in the game, unless you find some random attorney who's willing to do it for free. But how I get connected with them, I don't get connected with people locally directly. It all goes through our central intake unit in Raleigh. They call our helpline, and then wherever they live, if they meet our income requirements, then it gets transferred out. So that's how they get through to us.
Are you ever connecting, are you guys with legal aid? Are y'all ever connecting with folks at the point where you can have a argument about code enforcement, or are you simply on the defensive the whole time as you represent these tenants? Does that make sense as a question?
It makes sense. Yeah, it can be both. It's just unfortunately, like Dan said, we don't really have all that much we can really do. You know, like we can tell the tenant, okay, you need to send a new video, but we're not really going to get code enforcement to change what they're doing necessarily. We're just kind of working in what we have and trying to threaten the landlords. But yeah, I mean,
and what are the consequences for the landlords at the, in general? I'll ask you the question, I'll ask Dan the same question. What are the consequences for property owners that don't meet these code requirements, that have situations like what I described, I guess?
they can get fined by the city. They can be fined, but I don't necessarily know what happens if they don't pay it. And then, like Dan said, it's really pretty rare. But the rent abatement thing, I mean, tenants can file their own case against the landlord. And basically, what rent abatement is, it's saying, I want the value back of what I was paying versus what I should have been paying, given all these defects. But it's very hard for someone to do that without an attorney. And then for us, it's hard to do that type of case because it's hard to do. Even for an attorney, it takes a lot of resources, and we already are bogged down with all these evictions and everything else. So it's hard for us to take every problem that someone has. And like I said, we're the only free law firm in the game. So if you're asking a attorney who gets paid by clients to take a really resource intensive rent abatement case for free, that's going to be hard to find as well. But so basically, bottom line, there are very little consequences for the landlord, unfortunately.
I want to ask Dan the same question, and if you don't want to, if you feel like it's just a similar answer, then my question for you is, how do you guys go about educating about tenant rights?
Well, so I will say, just to back up and talk about consequences, they issue repair orders sometimes against landlords, and they can escalate up to the city deeming your property or the county deeming your property unfit for human habitation. And it does oftentimes lead to, if it's not addressed in 30 days, a $350 fine on the first day and a $100 fine each additional day. That's the city of Winston-Salem. However, the Triad City Beat reported a year and a half ago, before the pandemic, that both Greensboro and Winston-Salem have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars of landlord fines from code enforcement that have not been paid out. Greensboro did take the step, I think, of suing some of the most egregious landlords who had not paid code enforcement fines. They call it co-compliance in Guilford County. But I don't know of any landlords who have faced lawsuits from the city to collect on those code enforcement violations. So going to your next question about how do we try to educate, we try to provide resources. I mean, tenants know what's fair and what's not fair, right? They don't necessarily know that 311 is the number to call for a code inspection. They don't necessarily know, listen, if you have a SNAP card, you can go down to the courthouse and you can try to sue your landlord, and you can fill out every bad thing that has violated the lease that you can think of. And they will say to you at the clerk's office, that'll be $141 to file this. And they will not tell you necessarily, I don't know every clerk there, but clerks I've seen will not tell you that that SNAP card waives that fee, right? So it's little pieces of information like this. It's the gatekeeping that goes on in our court system and our city, where, again, you have to be like a videographer, like a master videographer to even in the last year get a worthy code inspection for the city. So it's like, how do we educate? Well, folks know that things are wrong, but there's these little pieces of information, and there's also support. Some of it's not education, it's just support. Do you need us to come help you video it? Do you need us to help you print photographs? Do you need us to help you set up an email address so we can actually put this in writing? Because when you're telling the landlord to fix it, it goes in one ear and out the other, right? So education, yes, but also we need resources. We need certain things that tenants are expected to do. Where's the written proof? Where's the photograph? So I didn't have enough money to go over to Walgreens and get the 3.5 by 5 prints of the leaky sink or whatever. So some of it is education, yes, but I feel like tenants know what's wrong and know that they could be suing their landlords, but are often under-resourced and being gate kept by a lot of these systems that judges won't, the burden of proof is way too high for a lot of tenants that know they've been wronged.
So there's a lot of conversation going on our Facebook page. It's kind of reflective of the wider community to a great degree. There's conversation about what we may be encouraging people to do. Like maybe we need to just kind of pay attention to the landlord piece of this conversation a little bit more. And there's definitely some comments about how do we support renters. I think overall, if I can put something out there, but I'd love for anybody to respond if you like, with shaking your head or nodding or saying words, whatever you feel good about. It seems like we're not trying to pit landlords and tenants against each other as much as we are trying to acknowledge that in the balance of justice, it is always in the areas that we are living in and working in, leaning heavily in favor of landlords and property owners. And so what we're doing is pushing down, as we do as advocates, to try to balance that out so we can have better, more diverse conversations and a goal setting. So if it looks like we're pushing on how do we support renters and you're a homeowner, that's a piece of what you're probably feeling here. But let me play devil's advocate for a minute. What about the landlords, the property owners? I mean, they've been going for a year now without any income. That income ain't coming when the moratorium's over. We know that. So don't we have some concerns about how they're getting by if they're making their money off of other people's housing? Let me bring in Krista, if I can throw you in the middle of all this. Just anything, or Francis or Dan, again, you can just shake your head.
Well, I'd like to respond that, yeah, I think there are differences between landlords. I am firmly on the side of the tenant here from my experience and from everything I've seen. But there was a study that just came out in the June issue of Social Forces. Like I said, I'm a sociologist, so I have to nerd out here a little bit. Small-time landlords that they defined as owning less than 4 properties are much less likely to file an eviction than a corporate landlord that owns 15 or more properties. And they did this study in Boston over the last year and a half. And it was just a huge difference. And the corporate landlords will file for really meager amounts too, that shows that they're using these as a way to collect just like any little debt. If I'm 200 or 100 behind, they'll be doing serial evictions. And next time I fall behind, they'll do it again, and they'll tack on the court costs and the, all the fees, the late fees. So there are differences. And at some point, yeah, we do have to be concerned about the corporatization of rental properties that's going on in Winston-Salem right now. If you read the Journal, it's like every day there's an out-of-state company buying another huge swath of properties in Winston-Salem. And they're much less likely to have any connection to the community. They're much more likely to file quickly and be brutal about seeking possession and monetary damages that they claim from these properties. So yeah, there are some, Jeff McIntosh calls them mom and pop landlords here in town that I believe you when you say, yeah, that they have probably been suffering this past year. Meanwhile, the city has 12.5 million. The city and county combined, the city got 8 million, the county got 4.5 million. Rental assistance. So the leftists in the United States have been saying since this pandemic began and we were all thrown out of work, we need to cancel rent. We need rent forgiveness. We need to just put this on hold, right? And that never happened, right? Trump wasn't going to do that. Biden certainly is not going to do that either. But what did happen is they shelled out quite a lot of stimulus money to local communities. And of this $12.5 million, as of 13 days ago, the city reported to Housing Justice Now that only 5.25% of it has actually made it out in the form of rental assistance or utility assistance. Now, they got this money back in December. They finally got the program open in April, beginning of April, and they only have until December to spend it, or it goes back to the federal government. We are hearing from tenants that it is nearly impossible to get this money. It's nearly impossible because they ask you for things like the landlord's email, and they were asking for proof of citizenship before we threatened to sue them with the NC Justice Center. There's all kinds of things that have been going on that the rent relief is there. Like the landlords could be getting paid if these bureaucratic, again, gatekeepers would allow the assistance that's been allocated. Again, $12.5 million. In my research, I've seen the average rent claim is about $1,600 in Winston-Salem since the pandemic began. If you divide, I'm not going to do the math right now, but if you divide $12.5 million by $1,600, they could be stopping so many evictions. They could be going to the clerk's office, finding out who's getting evicted, going directly to them and offering them help applying for this rent assistance. They're not doing it. And it's again, so we have to look at what is available right now and what is actually being done by the city, being done by the county to address this crisis. And I don't see a whole lot of help. So
I want to come back to that point, but let me bring in Krista there, who is engaged to some degree with that kind of work. And you can jump in with any part of this, Krista, but what do you think about that? What do you see? Are you connected with just programs that help people to access those monies? What's going on there?
Like the monies like ERAP for folks that come to us have been almost useless. And we've been told that ERAP is kind of expanding to help more folks, but it's still, you know, I'm so nervous when we fill out applications with people because I don't want to, you know, fill out anything fraudulently with somebody, because we've all been affected by COVID financially to some extent, right? And so that is the defining thing of ERAP. But there's nothing that just helps people that are just poor and have been poor prior to COVID. And COVID certainly exacerbated their options for jobs and that kind of thing. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
Yeah, I just figured that what Dan was bringing up, to some degree, you're seeing a piece of this and some of the problems with it, but also, you know, it's like you kind of we get one level of engagement with some assistance like that, and what we know to be true, what Dan's talking about, is there's the ability that if we were to open the floodgates on this, we could really have a massive impact. But why is that not happening? How can that happen? What political pieces prevent that from happening? You know, what new definitions of what rent means if we're starting to just pay it off, you know, and all of that. There's just a lot of things that hold that floodgate in place, I guess. So it was kind of interesting, the trickle that we get to benefit from in terms of our work and sharing that, but it's not meeting the need that we're talking about here, I guess.
The other thing I do think it's really important to say, and I think somebody mentioned it earlier, is that there is almost no assistance for rental arrears. And so that is going to be really hard for people as this moratorium ends.
So I want to, what I want to do at the right time, I'm going to look in Emily and Charlize's direction here. I want to make sure I'm like doing okay with time. I think I want to start bringing this towards a thought. I want to say like an action item. I want to say like a seismic shift. I want to say, you know, rent is theft or something. But like what we're going to end up saying instead is this. We like to build things. City with Dwellings likes to build things. And so here's what I'm hearing, and here's a thought. Krista, when we started out, you mentioned that someone is not HUD definition homeless if they end up doubling up with somebody. They have to be in a place not meant for human habitation, street, abandoned buildings, shelters, not a hotel, for example. So there is another definition of homelessness that comes from the Hearth Act that is connected to a revision of the McKinney-Vento bill. And what we have in the Hearth Act, we actually pull pieces from the Hearth Act when we do HUD-related activities. For example, the surge of rapid rehousing as a function to try to keep people quickly into housing as they get their, get a job or whatever. So we have utilized this, but in this Hearth Act, it does something really important. The homeless prevention is greatly expanded, and this is from like 2009, but homeless prevention is expanded, and a piece of the homeless prevention is this part of the new McKinney-Vento Act. It's not new anymore, it's 12 years old, but homelessness includes an individual or family who will imminently lose their housing. Now, it used to include like really tight what imminently means, but who are not going to be able to, like within a month, pay their rent. If they are facing down the possibility of an eviction coming their way, if there's credible evidence that the owner is not going to let them stay no matter what they do, all of a sudden those things fit into the definition of homelessness. And so what happened when that came out was a lot of resources poured out, but I feel like we misused it because HUD wasn't using the same definition as the Hearth one. They weren't on the same page, and we are HUD accountable to HUD. So I feel like what we ended up doing was basically saying there's a lot of resources for you to get housed again. There's rapid rehousing, there's permanent supportive housing, there are all these case managers ready to come along. So when you feel like you're about to run out of the ability to stay in your home, come on down to the shelters, y'all. We got a place for you. We'll give you a case manager and we'll get you right back into housing in like 7 to 10 days. And months later, that just didn't work, right? When it seems that it was actually built to say, let's get resources going, with use the phrase upstream. Let's go to the vulnerably housed place before the eviction, when it's possible that they could get evicted. Let's go there with our case management, with the dollars. Let's do all that and build a strategy at that point. In other words, if you want to end homelessness, let's end evictions. Like, let's just move our work up to that level and start to stabilize everybody at a housed place. And that means stably, not just the financial piece, but also making sure it's a safe housing situation. These dollars that we're talking about right here, it's not just in our community, like that, these are dollars that have been made available, just across the country as we face down this pandemic. But also, it didn't even take those dollars for us to be able to talk about this, because every community already has dollars that they spend through the eviction process. That, like, the whole eviction thing, like, takes money to keep that machine going. But we do have that money. It would be fascinating for us to strategize about how do we stop evictions. So not just clogging up the court, but clogging up the eviction process with supportive wraparound care, with funding that can go in that direction, funding that doesn't just come in this surge, but always is in the community, that was made available in that HUD revised plan. So that's ultimately kind of my question for you. I was doing some research on what's happening been happening in Syracuse, and they do this, and I love the phrase. The results are astounding. They dropped their number of eviction petitions for 1 year, 2017 to 18, from 834 eviction petitions to 203. The families kicked out of housing dropped by 2/3. And even with case management assigned, so the cost of case management, the community was still saved at the end of all that, over $100,000. So there's good evidence that going upstream and working at that location, which HARTH, that national act, asks us to consider how we would do that. I don't know what the problem is there, and so y'all can shoot me down on that as an idea, or you can shoot me down on like what we're missing here, you know, whatever. But I'm interested in seeing, does that sound like a way to try to not just have a moment with a tenant that will stop them from getting evicted in that moment, but maybe start to change the conversation about eviction in the community? Or is that just a crazy idea? Anyone want to jump in on that?
I have something to say on that, Russ, and it kind of ties back to what you said about, what about the landlords as well? In our office, I think it was because of the pandemic, but I don't really know. But the Winston-Salem Foundation got a grant for $100,000, and legal aid administers that money. There's no requirements on it. It's just money that we can use to help people. And that has been hands down the most effective way that we have stopped evictions before they started. And to be fair to the landlords, if you call them up and say, I can't offer you anything, but will you not do this? Because, it's people's lives. Why would they really say yes? But if we call them up and say, look, we have this money, all you have to do is, take it, and in exchange agree to give these people a break. We can get you paid. That has been the easiest way to stop evictions, literally. So I think that's a great idea. I don't know really where that money came from or anything about it. I just know that we got it. We've been using it. It's been really, really helpful. There's no sort of tenant, I need you to give me all this stuff. I just call the landlord, say, will you take this money? We give them a check, the end. That has been very, very, very effective.
And I want to invite others to jump in. What's interesting about that, Francis, is that there's another program in Cincinnati that didn't just have kind of the open-ended, kind of, we just want to prevent evictions. They actually looked at people who had a momentary crisis, like a very acute crisis, and let's support them. And so the same money was flowing, and it had the same impact, prevented a massive number of evictions. Krista, Dan, either of y'all want to jump in on whether that's a crazy idea or a workable one?
I don't think it's crazy at all. I think right now we are a housing only community, and for any real change to happen, that has to change. And I think it starts not at a level of people experiencing literal homelessness, but people that are housed in any capacity and having resources wrapped around them. Like something I've thought about that I recognize takes money to do on realty companies' parts is like realty companies having a tenant liaison at each property. And, when you move in, your tenant liaison meets with you and says, these are the resources available. And you stay in good contact the whole time. Before you hit the eviction process, that person is coming to you. And it's going to take crazy ideas that probably cost money to change things.
I could share a couple of examples. Philadelphia has just passed a law that says landlords must seek rent assistance on behalf of their tenants before filing an eviction. Boulder, Colorado has recently passed a tax, and landlords, depending on the number of units that they have, they pay by the unit, will put into a fund for legal counsel for tenants, and there's guaranteed representation now in Boulder, Colorado. Going back to Philadelphia, homeless and housing unstable folks were occupying a dozen properties that the Philadelphia Housing Authority was going to flip to a private developer, and demanded that 50 units, not just the dozen they were occupying, but 50 units be made into a community land trust. And the city of Philadelphia agreed to do it after a long occupation of those homes. We've seen it happening in Oakland, Moms for Housing. We've seen Even other cities in the South, New Orleans, taking some, what we might call here, like, well, that's crazy, that's so extreme, that's unfair. But, you know, the way that we're kind of breaking down the system, it seems like we need some crazy ideas. We need to look to other parts of, we could look to other parts of the world. Barcelona has a vacancy law now that says that if you are speculating on property and you're keeping it vacant, you will forfeit that property to the government to provide housing for other people. So there are a number of things that we could do. And it's just like, I think about the pandemic EBT card. My daughter goes to a Title I school. And one day during the beginning of the pandemic, it just showed up at my house. I had food stamps all of a sudden. I've never been on food stamps before. I don't need food stamps. But you know, it's like so easy for them to do this if they wanted to, right? That they could just see, what are the zip codes where evictions are happening? Where are the renter occupied homes? Let's make sure that those tenants have money to pay their landlords. Let's make sure their landlords are getting paid if we're very concerned about their landlords. So we can do this. Like, it's just the will is not there. So there's a lot of things that we could explore and learn from other places and bring to Winston-Salem.
So I'm going to ask one question that seems to be helpful to get answered before we close up here. That came from somebody asking, but I'm asking in a slightly different way. If we were going to work towards some change, how does that work as far as the city and the county? Like, who are we working with when we're talking about these housing issues? How do they relate to each other? I mean, obviously there's county land and there's, you know, city, but when we're talking about housing, is there a different approach to each? Are they working with each other or in opposition? Dan or someone, can you help us understand that real quick?
I think we have to add the federal layer to it too, because HAWS is a federally funded entity. And when we see Crystal Towers being sold and the Housing Authority claiming that they can't afford to fix it, there's really no effort from the city or the county being made to help them with those repairs. We've seen HUD budgets going down, 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 especially around public housing. They want to get rid of these public housing buildings. But we know that Crystal Towers is a special place. Downtown is one of the last affordable housing. It houses seniors and disabled. So, you know, the city and the county could be working together. They could also be working to support the Housing Authority, or they could be taking matters into their own hands. And again, go to other cities and learn that San Francisco is building municipal housing now. Like, they're going to be the ones that provide public housing at the city level. So certainly they could be working better together, and certainly we could be getting more help federally and having our local officials cooperate with the Federal Housing Authority, HAWS, here.
So I'm just going to ask Francis and Krista, do y'all have any last words for us? Any give us a little bit of courage here. Give us a little something we can wrap our arms around, or you can just you know, kind of bless us if you like. But any last words here?
I had a last word, but it wasn't positive. It was just something negative I forgot to say at the beginning.
Please go ahead.
So like Dan said, we are seeing less evictions, but I just wanted to add something I forgot to say. A big reason for that is because a lot of the landlords that we, you know, like working with are following the rules right now. Like the housing authorities, they're really not evicting people right now. All the low income federally subsidized housing have pretty much been following the moratorium the whole time. So that's a whole another community that we're seeing that have not been being evicted right now, but are behind and are going to be soon when the moratorium is up. So sorry, that's not positive, but I just wanted to point that out.
It's okay. I always look to Krista for a good positive last word.
Look in the wrong place. This might be positive, I don't know. I more so have encouragement that this is going to keep being a problem as long as we don't all talk about it and talk loudly, and to the city and the county and everybody. You know, we have to care for change to happen, and there are obviously great resources to learn how to best care and best be active about a topic. And that's the only way any of this is going to change.
Yeah, Dan, go ahead.
I think we can change this. I think we have to stop waiting for the city and county officials that we currently have to do something about it. I think we can do something if we organize together, if we demand these changes. We have to drag them into this fight. Like if you look at a lot of, like, we get calls from CNBC and Time Magazine all the time. They want to know, like, if we have tenants who are facing eviction, because a lot of this stuff happens in the shadows. We have to bring it to the light. We have to make it an issue because it is an issue, and we have to replace the system that we currently have. We have to add rent control. We have to add all sorts of things that there will be a lot of, well, let's just say resistance to, but if we organize, we can achieve it. We have the power as individuals and as a society to do this change, that we can make housing a human right. So I want to end on that note and just be positive, as you asked.
Yeah. So agreed. I'll close my part with these words. I really do think we have the power to make a change and a difference. I think that shows up in two really specific ways at this moment in time out of this conversation. A lot of issues at work here with evictions, but these are the things that stand out to me. One is supporting folks who are burdened with the threat of eviction or a history of evictions. And so we rally around in terms of what does that mean for you to thrive again, you to be able to move forward. And there's a lot of different ways that we can do that in organizing and supporting, and then also, kind of like Francis described that situation, like getting ahead of the eviction when money's an issue and trying to figure out, like, how do we have those conversations about solving that problem with the real tangible things that both parties need. One needs income coming in, the other needs housing. So we have those conversations. On the other hand, it just seems that we in the local community have the ability to change a culture around waiting for someone to become homeless to really allow homeless related resources to meet them. I'll mention this and then I'll be quiet. In that Hearth Act, in that McKinney-Vento Act, it started to unlock some things, and at least 40% of ESG funds are dedicated to prevention activities. That's an incredible amount of resources that are designed to keep people from this same situation we're talking about. And it took us until this past year, a couple of years maybe, to really start to ask at the COC level, the homeless agency level, how do we do something like that, right? Like, how do we do this kind of prevention work? Let's hire prevention experts and things like that. But this has been around since 2009. So we've had the chance, and we've got to be smarter together about how we use the resources that are already at our disposal. And to me, that's systemic stuff, but it's also culture changing stuff. It's saying city with dwellings can't wait for someone to become homeless to serve them in that vulnerable situation. And so we look at, hey, that money's there. We need to figure out how we move upstream and get ahead of this. We don't need eviction, whether we're talking about the housing authority stuff or private market, to be the way that we succeed at getting people housed anymore. Y'all have been great. Thanks for this conversation. And I'm gonna send it back over to Charlisa, I think.
Okay, sorry about that, guys. I couldn't find the mute button. Guys, Krista, Dan, Francis, Russ, thank you so much for this enlightening and very informative conversation. And I can say it was definitely a little bit discouraging. But thank you so much for everything that you shared with us tonight. And guys, also thank you so much for giving us a little bit of hope. And hope, and knowing that hopefully change will be on the way if we all work together to try and effectuate that change. And just like I think Dan said, it's crazy ideas. We can make it happen. A lot of things. I'm sure at some point, cell phones were crazy ideas. This whole internet thing, Zoom, a year ago or 2 years ago, no one would have ever thought we would have been doing this. What a crazy idea, but yet here we are. And so I think if we all put together and everyone does their part, and everyone get in where they fit in, maybe we really can make change happen. And it just takes all of us to do our part. So on that note, I will say again to everyone, thank you on the panel, all of you out there in Facebook world, thank you for joining in and just taking the time out of your busy day to learn about the eviction process. And just think about ways that you too can help. And I guess on that note, we'll see you next month. Stay tuned to our Facebook page or to our website to find out the next topic for our next month's Roots in Response. God bless. Have a great night, everyone.